We've looked at some regional examples of areas that have different growth rates. 39 goes more in depth about differing growth rates. We'll talk about compounding growth, how to increase your growth, and also some of the negative consequences of rapid economic growth. Growth rates between nations can have a really huge impact on their quality of life and their standards of living because growth rates tend to compound from one year to the next. So you can see in this visual, all of the countries are starting at the same place. But if they have different rates of growth, so you can see 8% versus 12%, because the growth compounds, that means that 8% the first year, then you're going to have 8% in addition the following year. So it's 8% on top of a larger number, and so on and so on and so on each year. So even though it might look like 8% and 12% are only a 4% difference, that's only the first year. As the growth rates compound, the gap between those two countries is going to get larger and larger and larger. So something as small as only having a 1% difference in your growth rate over decades will have a huge impact on your nation overall. Here's an example, very simplified, looking at two different people and how growth rates can compound, and also how we would set up an equation to measure something like this. So here we have two people, Jamal and Angelina. They both have $10,000 that they want to invest. So both of the equations for each person will start with $10,000 because that's where they're beginning. They both have 30 years until they retire. So that's the length of time that we're looking at. So it's the exponent for both of them. We're going to raise their interest rates to 30 for 30 years. Now they qualify for different interest rates. Jamal is saving his money at a rate of 3%, and Angelina at a rate of 2.5%. So there's only a 0.5% difference originally in their interest rates. But these are going to be compounding interest rates, and because they have such a long time period, you can see that 3%, if we're adding interest, and because they're earning interest, it would be added, you're going to set that up as 1.03. Remember, when we add interest, it's 1 plus the interest rate converted into a decimal. So $10,000 times 1.03 raised to 30 for the length of time. At the end of 30 years, you can see Jamal's total amount that he has earned from his investment. Angelina, we would set hers up also times 1 plus her interest rate converted into a decimal times the same time period. And even though she's making a large amount of money, it is less than his. And when we calculate the difference after 30 years, that 0.5% difference becomes 14% because the gap gets wider each and every year as that growth compounds. Now, clearly, if we're talking about national economies, they're going to be starting at a much higher number than $10,000. So if we're talking about GDPs in the billions or trillions, that gap can compound even bigger. And also many countries have larger gaps of growth rates, more than just 0.5% difference. But this is kind of a simplified way to see how growth compounds and how it will impact the bottom line after time has passed. We learned the three categories that add to productivity are increasing your physical capital, the amount of tools and equipment available to your workforce, upgrading educational level, which is going to advance your human capital, as well as increasing your technological advances. So all of those things add to productivity. Think about it, which one adds to productivity the most? Technology has the biggest impact overall. And we also saw that some countries might focus on one area of productivity, but not all of them. And countries that have the highest rates of growth are actually making concerted efforts to focus on all three of these factors of productivity, things that can help them advance and have the highest growth possible. We looked at Eastern Asia as our example of a region of the world that's focusing on all three factors of productivity simultaneously. Let's go in depth about all three of these categories for productivity growth. So currently China has the fastest growing economic rates. They have the fastest growing major economy. And in 2009, their level of investment spending was 44% of the country's GDP, compared to in the United States, where our percent of GDP that we focused on investment spending was only 18%. If you recall, savings equals investment spending. So if your country saves more money, the government, if your individual households save more money, and if you have foreign capital inflows flowing into your nation, all of those things provide more loanable funds for banks and more savings that they can then turn into investment spending to finance things for businesses. So nations that have a high savings rate will have higher investment spending, since S equals I. Investment spending can be spent on all kinds of things for a business. But, if your company decided to spend money on, new uniforms and things like that, that's not going to contribute to economic growth. But if investment spending is spent on something like capital goods, physical capital, for example, maybe businesses are investing in equipment, in machinery, in tools for their workers to be productive. That type of investment spending absolutely contributes to long-run economic growth. So higher savings equals higher rates of investment spending. If investment spending is spent on capital goods, higher rates of economic growth. In order to focus on human capital, there's two major subcategories of human capital. We're looking at the health of the labor force as well as the education level of the labor force. So nations with higher rates of education that spend more money investing in education have faster rates of economic growth than countries that either don't spend money on education or don't provide equal access to education across the labor force. This also goes along with countries that spend money with healthcare concerns, with nutrition, with vaccines, with clean drinking water. All of those things are going to help human capital and can also create long-term productivity boosts. And then for technological progress, there are some nations that decide to spend money in research and development. They want to focus on adding new technologies, coming up with new innovative ways to use existing resources, and all of those things will enhance the technology part of the factor of productivity growth. Knowing what you need to do to encourage economic growth, governments have a really important role to play. Some governments decide to promote economic growth. Other countries block long-term economic growth. Usually they're not intentionally blocking economic growth, but some of the policies that they decide to focus on have the result of blocking economic growth. In terms of physical capital, governments can decide to provide infrastructure for the nation. So infrastructure is a very broad category. It includes roads, airports, seaports, electrical grids. If you decide to provide electricity or even internet across your nation, that's going to have a big impact in terms of productivity for your businesses. They also can decide if they want to maintain roads, build highways, encourage that sort of development or not. If the internet or the electricity of a nation become unreliable, that's going to hurt productivity. And foreign companies are not going to want to come into a nation and set up as many new locations if they feel like the infrastructure is weak. But if those things are powerful, there's excellent airports and interstate systems and things like that, businesses feel like this might be a place that they can see themselves doing business. This next category, health infrastructure, can be confusing because this you could put either under physical capital or under human capital, because health is going to clearly impact that other factor of your labor force. Health infrastructure is the idea that nationwide, are you setting up systems and structures to make sure that your people are healthy? So if you require vaccinations, if you make sure that safe drinking water is available, if you look into regulations for maybe pesticides or food safety laws, things like that are these nationwide systems that the government controls. And if they make the labor force healthier, they can lead to productivity. And that's why this category of health infrastructure could either be put into physical capital or human capital. And the last part of physical capital here is the banking system. So financial institutions like banks and stock markets usually are regulated by governments, and that can lead to more consumer confidence for capital inflows, etc. If you're in a country where the government doesn't have any sort of regulation over banks, that leads to declines in consumer confidence. People won't feel as safe putting their money into banks. If there's a reduction in savings, that also leads to a reduction in investment spending, since those two things are equal. So governments can decide if it's important to them or not to make sure that money is considered safe in their banking systems. That can lead to growth. For the human capital category, governments that pay or contribute large amounts of money to primary and secondary education are often contributing to the advancement of human capital. Primary education, we're talking about elementary school. Secondary education normally goes through high school, but in some cases can also include if your nation desires to maybe subsidize college education or make it more available to your labor force. Any of those things, if you increase the education of your workforce, you can increase their productivity. And education is absolutely a long-term productivity boost, because that labor force is not only better this year, but they'll be better for years to come. So this is a choice that governments make in terms of where they want to spend their money if they're trying to encourage growth. So education is not the only part of human capital, it's also the health of your labor force. So governments can have the option of promoting health research. There's lots of things that we do in America. The Human Genome Project was working on figuring out genetic sequencing for hereditary diseases and things like that. We look into cancer treatment options. We also have a lot of grants. The National Institute of Health is a government subsidized program that makes sure that we're looking into maybe cures for diseases and cause for diseases. We have the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. So in America, there's lots of ways that the government is looking into health research. All of these things, theoretically, if your workers are healthier, there's going to be fewer sick days and more productive years that they can contribute to your economy. For the third category, governments can choose to finance technology innovations. So R&D stands for research and development, and most of this is done by private companies in America, but sometimes they receive grants and government subsidies if the government considers the R&D to be something that might be beneficial for the nation at large. Also, the government sometimes does their own large-scale R&D projects for things that they feel like are beneficial. Historically, you can look at the Manhattan Project, and everything that we learned about nuclear weapons could be used in order to build nuclear power plants. So we're using that now for large-scale growth of our economy. We also finance things like NASA that are constantly doing research and coming up with new ideas that we can then employ in other areas of our economy. Anything like that that we learn from R&D can become a long-run growth opportunity. The past few slides have all been about what governments can do right if they're trying to encourage long-term economic growth. Now we'll talk about how they can do things wrong. We're going to have a fake nation called Corruptopia. And if a business wants to set up a new factory in Corruptopia, they're going to have to go through all of these steps to get established. If you're working through getting approval and you're getting the local permits and whatever approval process is necessary, and then that government gets overthrown, you might have to start from scratch. So if there's political instability of a nation, people often don't want to get involved setting up new businesses. Same with if the government is corrupt, as the name Corruptopia implies, and sometimes governments will take over factories. They'll seize businesses, they'll claim eminent domain or whatever justification they want to say that they actually now control this. In many parts of the world, businesses are taken over by corrupt governments, and if that's happening in a place, that's going to discourage any other companies from setting up business there. Also, it's not just the government that could be corrupt. Maybe the court system is corrupt. In some places, it can take months and months and months to set up any new business because you constantly have to bribe local officials and all the way up on the chain to get approval. So if you feel like there's no transparency or it's not clear how one goes about setting up a business, all those things are going to discourage capital inflows and discourage new investment of businesses in your country. And if people don't want to bring in money and business to your country, you can see how those things could absolutely hurt your long-run growth potential. Another way that governments can discourage growth is by excessively intervening in their markets, in their businesses. So sometimes they put really high business taxes on especially new businesses or maybe foreign businesses. They might also have a lot of tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on foreign goods. So if you're a foreign company, or even if you're a local company, but you need to buy materials that are made in other parts of the world, really high tariffs could be a deterrent for you. Also, some governments have anti-competitive policies. So in America, we discourage monopolies. We are trying to encourage competition in those things. But in other parts of the world, that isn't necessarily true. And you could have things that discourage new companies from starting if they're competing with local companies or with government-run companies. So all of those things that intervene and make it difficult to set up new businesses also are going to hurt economic growth. Remember, there's a difference between market economies and command economies. Market economies are sometimes called free market economies, and these often have less government involvement than the opposite end of the spectrum called command economies, where the government is much more actively involved in what companies are allowed to do, what they're allowed to produce, maybe even quotas, etc. So in market economies, the concept is that incentives exist which encourage people to grow. So the government shouldn't necessarily tell you what you have to do. The idea is if you are spending more money, advancing your own company, encouraging higher productivity, not only is that good for your business, but if every business is doing what's good for their business, it should, theoretically, be good for economic growth. You're creating jobs, you're bringing in more money, you're coming up with new innovations, new technology, you're finding ways to grow. So the concept of free markets is that people and businesses respond to their own incentives to do what's best for growth. Here we have a long list of things governments can do if they're trying to encourage growth, encourage job creation, etc. So if growth is slow and unemployment is high, the government can give investment tax credits. So sometimes they're going to encourage businesses If you set up a new location, if you create a certain amount of jobs, then we'll give you a tax credit. So that's going to add an incentive for businesses to grow. They also can do job training programs. These are going to be especially helpful for structural unemployed people. Remember, people that are structurally unemployed are unemployed because their skills are considered obsolete. So if you have a lot of people that are not able to find jobs in a modern economy, the government could decide to create programs to help give them the skills they need to find new jobs. And that will create a decrease in the unemployment rate, is the hope. Governments can also decide to provide unemployment insurance or unemployment benefits. Now, this is one of the controversial things because some people are saying, well, if you're giving money to the unemployed, what would give them an incentive to find a job or to gain the skills they need to find a new job? The counter argument is that if the unemployed do have some money that allows them to buy goods and services, which is aggregate demand. So if we have high unemployment, but people do have some money, that will help the economy overall, and hopefully they will find a job soon. Governments can decide to use other fiscal policies. We talked about taxes a little bit, but they could also do government spending, maybe start building more bridges and infrastructural things, which would not only help us get out of that recessionary gap, but would help with long-run growth. Or they could work with transfers and taxes. And then we have some patent and copyright laws in America. The idea is we consider in America it important to give people rights to their ideas. If people are constantly, if you go through all of the work of developing a new vaccine or designing a new product, and then someone else can make a generic right away, it discourages that innovation. So the concept is that you protect innovation if you give people a few years at least so that their new invention is copyright protected. It discourages competition at the beginning to encourage that growth. In other countries where they don't have copyright laws, there's knockoffs all over the place where people are creating a copy of what you just made. So one of the reasons why we are considered to be high in innovation is through these laws. So here we have a large number of things governments can do if they're trying to get involved by encouraging growth. This entire lecture thus far has all been about encouraging economic growth and increasing economic growth. But the counter argument is, do we want high rates of economic growth? Is there any consequence to increasing our long-run economic growth? And one of the main areas where this is called into question is about environmental sustainability. If you have higher rates of economic development, that often goes along with higher rates of pollution, and it can put a strain on your natural resources if you're using those factors of production like land at rates higher than you're able to fix that problem. So let's say you're cutting down trees to build factories faster than you're able to plant new ones. So there is a question of how much growth is good for our planet. It might be good for the economy, but there's something to be said for controlling the growth and making sure that it's sustainable. Natural resources, of course, are scarce, but economists feel like this will be a problem the market will fix itself because people respond to incentives. Scarcity leads to high prices. When something is limited in its supply, the price goes up. And when prices go up, people respond to that price incentive by consuming less of that product. So for example, oil is scarce in many cases, and when oil is scarce, it makes oil prices rise. So this creates incentives for both consumers and producers. Consumers might decide to buy less oil, maybe switch to some other product if they can. Producers realize that the high price of oil has created this major demand for alternative products. So entrepreneurs might emerge that will spend more money on hybrid cars and electric cars, solar energy, or any other appliances that use things other than oil. So because scarcity raises prices, that encourages people to use less of that product, which will help in the long run with people discouraging their use of the scarce and expensive resource. So the hope is that those limited resources won't disappear as quickly when people respond to the incentive of the high price and trying to avoid it. There has often been a trade-off between doing what's best for economic growth or doing what's best for the environment. Oftentimes, you have to pick one or the other, and many societies around the world have decided to focus more on economic growth than on environmental sustainability. So they'll only worry about the environmental problems when things become so bad that they feel like they have to. They often put business ahead of the environment. So in this picture, we see the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland, Ohio. This river caught fire about 13 times before the end of the 1960s because there was so much pollution in the river, some runoff from local businesses and things like that. So this pollution created chemicals on the top surface of the water that were highly flammable. And when people started seeing a river catching fire, that's a pretty drastic image, and that led to new laws and new regulations that have gone into effect since then. They've actually done quite a bit to clean up this river. But as you can see, it had to get very far before those laws and regulations were adopted. A major issue that people come across when looking at environmental impact of development and growth is that pollution does not stay contained within national boundaries. So if emissions are going up in a neighboring country, it's very hard for one country to put strict caps on their emissions and on their pollution, but realizing that their air is impacted by the air next door. And so that will absolutely impact their people as well. Same with things like rivers and bodies of water. If a neighboring country, or even in America's sake, sometimes our environmental laws can be state by state. So let's say one state has very strict standards and their rivers are not polluted, but the neighboring state doesn't. So that you can still have pollutants flowing in from a country next door. So you can't necessarily control other people's pollution. And sometimes, if those controls are considered bad for business, being tough on environmental regulations can encourage businesses to go to that other state or that other country that don't have those high standards. So there's this trade-off of what do we do? How important do we determine that this issue is? Can we limit it? What if there's an economic cost to us if we choose to limit it? Here we have a chart that shows the United States, Europe, and China's amount of carbon dioxide emissions. Now, historically, the Western countries industrialized first, which meant that not only are we developing sooner, but we also started polluting and creating emissions earlier. So historically, these Western nations have had really high rates of emissions, but they're beginning to drop off, and a lot of these countries are starting to put in place more environmental safeguards. The developing nations, as they're industrializing later, are starting to pollute more and more and more. So you can see that the US and Europe, their lines are fairly stagnant, fairly flat, but China's is starting to go up, up, up. So the question is, when these countries meet at global summits to talk about environmental regulations, who is responsible for undoing the damage and for cleaning up the environment? Is it the countries that have polluted in the past, or the polluters of the future, the groups that are starting to have high rates now in the name of developing and catching up? So there's a lot of pointing fingers and people not wanting to take on this responsibility because lots of groups are polluting. The question is, who should be responsible for doing something about it moving forward? And if we decide to, let's say, put tighter regulations on places like China, is that hindering their long-run growth potential? So there's a lot of debate about this moving forward. Hopefully the picture is becoming clear that business and economic growth can create environmental issues, but that when you try to get involved with curbing these environmental problems, that often can cost businesses money. If you limit the amount of pollutants that they can put into the atmosphere, that often imposes costs onto businesses as they figure out how to dispose of their waste in a way that fits the standards. So economists have done different policies in terms of how do we reduce emissions without hurting businesses. Now, a lot of their solutions do still impose a cost. So one of the ideas is a carbon tax. And that's this concept that however much is polluted by a business, they have to pay taxes to offset the cost of cleanup, maybe planting trees or doing other things to try to undo the damage of the emissions. There's also some states that have something called a cap and trade legislation, where the idea is there's a limited amount, a cap, a maximum on how much you can pollute. If you go over this cap, then you would pay penalties. But if you go under the cap, you have carbon credits that you can trade with other businesses. So that gives businesses an incentive. If they pollute less, they can actually make money by selling their carbon credits to other businesses. Environmentally, you still would theoretically have the same amount of emissions because other countries are then able to pollute more if they buy carbon credits. But the idea is that hopefully at the end of the day, businesses will see that there are ways for them to still be profitable and pollute less if they're trying to go underneath this cap on their emissions. So there are some different solutions being debated, and some states have different environmental laws than others. So we'll see.